Picture the scene in an academic office in Aarhus, Denmark. Resting on top of a whiteboard in a room full of high-level research is a rough, ordinary block of wood. Scrawled across it in marker is just one single word: ethics. It looks like a prop from a comedy sketch, but it was actually the desperate solution to a bureaucratic nightmare. A professor there had been awarded a prestigious EU grant, but the agency refused to release the money unless her work underwent an ethics board review. The problem: Denmark doesn't actually have a government review board for non-medical studies. She was trapped in a catch-22. She needed approval from a body that didn't exist. So her postdoc went out, found a piece of lumber, wrote on it, and handed her a literal ethics board. It's a hilarious, absurd image, a piece of wood standing in for institutional oversight. But that block of wood actually acts as the perfect totem for a much darker, more chaotic reality in the scientific world. Because while Denmark has no rules, other nations have rules that are dangerously loose. Just take a look at the recent scandal out of the University of Zurich. While the Danes were worrying about wooden boards, Swiss researchers were unleashing bots onto Reddit. These weren't just scraping data, they were assuming fake personas, pretending to be victims of sexual assault or marginalized minorities, and actively manipulating real human users to change their political views. And the most unsettling part: despite how dystopian that sounds, under their country's specific policies, they were technically allowed to do it.
That paradox is, it's just perfect. The bureaucratic void on one side and this ethically catastrophic but technically legal bot study on the other, it really does encapsulate the entire crisis.
A crisis of modern research ethics. We're in this chaotic space because the systems we have, they just weren't designed for the world we live in now.
Exactly. When you say systems, you're talking about things like the U.S. Institutional Review Board, the IRB.
Right, the IRB, or its European equivalent, the REC, the Research Ethics Committee.
And those structures were born out of a very different era. They were designed primarily for clinical trials.
Yeah.
In hospitals.
Physical interventions.
Yes. Physical interventions on human bodies.
Yeah.
With people in a specific room in a specific city, citing a specific piece of paper that says, "I consent." The entire framework is built on that tangible, geographically bound interaction.
And that framework is completely, utterly useless when you're talking about borderless behavioral research that happens instantly, with bots and fake IDs and scraped data from all over the world.
It just doesn't apply. The rules haven't just failed to catch up to the technology. They're playing a completely different sport.
So that's the friction we need to unpack today. This deep dive is all about that clash between, these national outdated oversight bodies and the global instantaneous internet.
Right. We'll look at the jurisdictional chaos, the failure of academic ethics to police what is essentially digital trespass.
And the vacuum that's created, who fills it?
The platforms. Private companies have become the de facto ethical gatekeepers. And then finally, we really need to get into the human and the financial cost of all this digital deception, because it's not just an academic problem. It has real-world consequences.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation, the traditional model.
Yeah.
The IRB, the REC, what is their core purpose, and where does it all start to fall apart when you introduce the internet?
Well, their core purpose is, it's fundamental to good science. They're supposed to be these independent, interdisciplinary committees.
A mix of scientists, ethicists, lay people.
Exactly. And their job is really threefold. First, ensure the science is actually good, that it's quality research. Second, and most importantly, guarantee the safety and welfare of the subjects. And third, make sure there's a favorable risk-benefit ratio. That the potential good outweighs any potential harm.
That sounds solid on paper, but you're saying the moment you leave a single hospital, the cracks start to show.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Because the models vary so dramatically from country to country. There is no global standard.
Give us a concrete example of that. How does the U.S. system differ?
Okay, take the U.S. Common Rule. It's the federal policy that governs all this stuff, and it's hugely influential. But it has these specific allowances, you could call them loopholes, that create serious ethical gaps online.
Loopholes like what?
For instance, it allows for pretty significant exemptions for what's called the secondary use of existing data sets.
So data that's already out there.
Right. As long as that data is either, quote, publicly available, or it's recorded in a way that you can't easily identify who the person is.
And that's the dangerous assumption, isn't it? The idea that if you can access it on the internet, it's publicly available and therefore, fair game. No consent needed.
That is the single most dangerous assumption driving almost all of this digital trespass.
Yeah.
It's led to this feeling among some researchers of, entitlement. A sense that they have a right to free access to any health data set on the internet, even if it's from a closed forum for, say, cancer patients.
Wow. And the structure of the system itself can create conflicts of interest, right? I'm thinking of these commercial ethics boards.
Yes. This is something pretty unique to the US and Canada. They permit non-institutional, for-profit commercial RECs.
So a company you hire to approve your research.
A company you pay. They're used a lot for industry-sponsored trials. And the critique is, well, it's obvious. How can you be truly impartial if the people whose research you're evaluating are also your clients?
It just screams conflict of interest. Critics must have a field day with that.
They do. It's often called ethics shopping. The fear is that a big pharma company, for example, will just shop around for a commercial REC that's known for giving fast, maybe less rigorous approvals.
Because time is money.
Time is a lot of money. And this structure is it's prohibited in places like the UK and Israel for that very reason. They want to maintain that wall of impartiality.
So you have different ethical standards, different tolerance for commercial influence. What about just the raw bureaucracy of it all? If you're running a big trial across, say, 10 hospitals in 10 states, that used to mean 10 separate reviews, didn't it?
A bureaucratic nightmare, an absolute nightmare. Every single IRB at every single hospital had to approve the protocol independently.
That sounds insane. You'd get 10 different sets of feedback, 10 different lists of required changes.
And you did. It led to massive inconsistencies, huge delays, and it could genuinely threaten the validity of the research itself. Just coordinating it all was a full-time job.
It almost sounds like a system designed to slow down science, not help it.
It was recognized as a huge barrier. So, to their credit, both the US and the UK have moved to fix this. They now require a single IRB or REC of record for multi-site research.
One board, one decision.
One clear, consistent, ethical mandate that applies to all the sites. It streamlines the whole process immensely.
But has everyone adopted that common sense approach?
Not entirely. Israel, for example, started a pilot program for something similar in 2020. But it's limited. It can only review what they call non-special trials. So even for something as basic as efficiency, there are still these deep jurisdictional divides that researchers have to navigate before they even begin.
And this all feeds into that hyper-regulation critique you hear so much about from scientists. They say the red tape is just strangling innovation.
That's the core tension, isn't it? The critique is that these incredibly complex, time-consuming regulations, especially for clinical trials, just discourage people. It makes the research prohibitively expensive.
So it pushes out the smaller, independent academic labs.
Completely. If you don't have a massive corporate sponsor with a team of lawyers and compliance officers, it's very, very hard to get a major trial off the ground.
Is that critique actually legitimate, though? Or is it just, industry complaining about safety rules that cost them money? Is there evidence that these delays actually cost lives?
I think it's a bit of both. There is real evidence that the administrative friction, the bureaucracy, slows down everything and drives up costs. And that does limit the number of studies that get done. Some critics genuinely see it as obstructing high-quality science, even a threat to public health.
But at the same time, those regulations exist for a reason.
They exist because of past failures, because of studies with undisclosed risks or, terrible consent practices. The goal isn't to get rid of regulation. The goal is to make it smarter, not just heavier.
And the regulations feel particularly unsmart when you leave the hospital and go online. This whole paradigm shift to big health data, using data that was collected for one reason for a completely new research purpose that just doesn't fit the old model at all.
It absolutely breaks the model. You're not dealing with a physical person and a consent form anymore. You're dealing with data flows, algorithms, anonymization techniques. And a huge problem is the expertise gap on the boards themselves.
Meaning the people on the IRBs don't understand the tech?
In many cases, no. Your typical IRB member is an expert in bioethics, in patient autonomy, in the classic informed consent process. They are not necessarily an expert in data science.
So they're trying to evaluate a complex computer science protocol with a checklist from the 1970s.
That's a perfect way to put it. They might not understand differential privacy or the weaknesses in certain anonymization tools that could let someone be re-identified. And this leads to researchers feeling like the review is totally arbitrary because the board doesn't actually grasp what they're doing.
So what's the solution? How are countries trying to fix this expertise vacuum?
They're trying to build new specialized bodies. We're seeing a real move internationally to create designated expert-based ethics committees just for big health data.
So boards with data scientists on them.
Exactly. Boards that have to include data scientists, information analysis experts, privacy protection officers. The UK is exploring this. Israel introduced draft regulations for it.
That just makes sense. You need technical experts to assess technical risks.
It does. It leads to a fairer review.
Yeah.
And it acknowledges that the risks are different. It's less about immediate physical harm and more about, data leakage, re-identification, or even harm to an entire group of people.
Okay, let's drill down on a really sensitive area that exposes this fragmentation. Genetic research. People talk about genetic exceptionalism.
Yes, and it's a perfect high-stakes example of just how varied the oversight is. Genetic information is just different. It doesn't just affect you. It affects your parents, your children, your entire family tree, maybe your whole community.
It's your blueprint.
It's your blueprint, and it carries information about your future risks in a way that, say, your blood pressure reading doesn't. And yet the way we regulate research on it is all over the map.
So how does a country like Israel, for instance, handle that exceptional risk?
Israel has one of the strictest systems in the world. To do genetic research there, you need to go through a very complex two-tiered review.
Two tiers.
First, the local IRB at the institution, but then it has to go to a national committee for final approval. Sometimes even the Director General of the Ministry of Health has to sign off. It shows how incredibly sensitive and valuable they consider that data.
And how does that compare to the UK? Their approach seems more focused on the context of consent.
That's right. In the UK, it all pivots on two things. Can the sample be identified? And was consent given? So research on DNA needs REC approval only if the material is non-identifiable and it was stored without consent for research.
So if the person already consented to their DNA being used for research, you don't need another ethics approval for that specific law.
Correct. It's a much more nuanced, context-based approach.
Now let's put that next to the US, especially on the real cutting edge, like human genome editing.
And this is where you see the most astonishing gaps in regulation, especially when private money gets involved. Take heritable human genome editing, HGGE.
This is making genetic changes that can be passed down to future generations. Designer babies, essentially.
That's the fear. Now, in the U.S., using federal public money for that kind of research is prohibited by law.
Okay, that sounds sensible.
But so, Shay, there are no federal laws banning privately funded HGGE.
Wait, really? So if you're a billionaire with a biotech firm in the U.S., you could theoretically start research to alter the human germline, and you'd be bypassing the entire public ethical debate.
That is the gaping regulatory void. It shows how our system allows private funding to just sidestep the public scrutiny that would apply to a university researcher using a federal grant. The result is this patchwork system where the seriousness of the ethical challenge is not matched by the consistency of the rules.
So the official system can't even regulate itself consistently on massive issues like editing human DNA. If that's the starting point, I can only imagine the mess when they try to regulate a bunch of vulnerable patients talking on a website. Okay, let's move from that high-level regulatory chaos to the ground-level failures. This really boils down to that crucial, faulty distinction researchers make between what's public and what's private online.
This assumption, this faulty idea of a public space, is behind almost every case of academic digital trespass. It's a fundamental misunderstanding. Researchers operate under this belief that if they can access the data, it's in the public domain, and that just wipes away the need for informed consent.
It's a total lack of what you called cultural sensitivity. They don't understand the norms of the community they're studying.
They don't, because accessibility isn't consent. Just because my front door is unlocked doesn't mean you have an invitation to come in and photocopy my diary.
It's a perfect analogy.
And in these online communities, especially closed networks or sites where you need a login, users have a very high expectation of privacy. It doesn't matter what the 20-page terms of service document says. When you're talking about your cancer diagnosis, you operate under an implicit contract of trust with the other people in that forum.
So the ethical rule should be, what? If you need an email to get in, it's not public.
That should be the conservative ethical starting point.
Yeah.
If access requires a login, a password, any kind of membership, you should assume its users do not consider it public, and therefore you need consent.
The ethical bar doesn't just vanish because the medium changed from paper to pixels.
It doesn't. And this gets so much more acute when you're dealing with vulnerable people. We can see this play out in 4 real-world cases from an online health community, patients like me. And what's so wild is that this is a platform that is dedicated to research. And still, these violations happened.
Okay, let's walk through them. Case 1 was just pure corporate exploitation, wasn't it?
Straight up commercial scraping. A firm without authorization used scraper bots, these automated programs, to just hoover up all the visible health data on the site.
What kind of data?
Really sensitive stuff. Patient-reported responses to different treatments. I mean, that's incredibly valuable proprietary data. It was a clear violation of the site's terms of use. Digital theft for profit.
And what happened? Did they get away with it?
They got called out publicly, even in the news. And at first, they defended it. They called it a legacy practice, just how they'd always done business, before finally saying they'd stop. The platform had to respond by upgrading its bot detection software, which is a constant arms race, and just try and make it clear what the legitimate channels for research are.
Okay, so that's commercial theft. Case 2 moves into academic carelessness, and this one sounds like it caused permanent harm. De-anonymization.
It was a catastrophic and, frankly, rookie mistake. A researcher was writing a paper and used a verbatim quote from a forum post. Now, the key detail is that this forum was behind a login. It wasn't being indexed by Google.
But the paper was.
The paper was.
Yeah.
So that using that exact quote, the HIV-positive patient who wrote it suddenly became identifiable with a simple Google search. You could link the quote in the public paper directly back to their profile.
So the researcher, with one careless action, created a permanent digital trail that outed a vulnerable person.
Permanently. And this is a direct violation of international ethics guidelines, specifically CIMS Guideline 22, which says you have to take measures to protect privacy. The harm is indelible. Even if that patient deletes their account, that quote is now forever in the scientific literature.
How do you even begin to fix that? Can you?
You can only do damage control. The platform had to contact the journal and the authors, and they agreed to a partial retraction. They took out the real quote and replaced it with the synthetic paraphrased one. But the lesson is crystal clear. You have to paraphrase. Never use verbatim quotes for this kind of sensitive data. And the fact that an IRB didn't catch that risk is a huge failure.
Case 3 is maybe the most disturbing because this wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate deception by university students who somehow got ethics approval for it.
This case is a stunning indictment of the system. Researchers from a major European university with grant money and official REC approval created 20 fake patient profiles. 20. And they entered deliberately false health data into this platform. Their goal was just to see if real users read the site's terms of use.
They weren't just observing, they were actively polluting a data set that's used by real patients, by regulators, by doctors to make decisions about real-world treatments.
That's the systemic harm. They were contaminating the well of knowledge. And when they were confronted, they were defiant. They said they didn't need permission because it was a publicly available forum. They didn't even think it was medical research. It shows a complete ethical blindness.
How did the platform finally get them to understand the harm?
They had to use an analogy. They said, imagine if your students went into a hospital emergency room and started pretending to be violently ill just to test if the signs on the wall were clear. Only then did they seem to grasp why what they did was fundamentally deceptive and damaging.
Unbelievable. And the final case, case 4, also involves massive deception, but this time with the goal of judging the patients themselves.
Yes. This one highlights a kind of algorithmic arrogance. Researchers used over 50 bot accounts, all traced to one small area, to secretly scrape patient self-reported data. And their goal was to train a neural network, an AI, to judge the soundness of a patient's report.
To judge the soundness of someone's description of their own suffering, that's not just bad methodology, it's philosophically offensive.
It's a massive violation of the principle of trusting the patient's narrative. The ethical failure here was twofold. First, the sheer scale of the deception with over 50 fake accounts, and second, the bias baked into the methodology itself. They were basically assuming that if a patient's story didn't perfectly match a medical textbook, the patient must be wrong or unreliable. They were trying to build an algorithm to dismiss lived experience.
So what was the final outcome there?
At first, the researchers denied everything, but the platform's security team had the receipts. They proved the 50-plus bots existed and were active, which forced a full retraction of the paper. And what this all shows, when you see that researchers either got REC approval or just argued their way around it, is that the traditional oversight mechanism is just broken. It completely fails to police these new methods of digital deception. It misses group harm, it misses re-identification risk, it misses everything.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's take this idea of deception, the bots, the misrepresentation, and pull it out of academia and into the corporate world. We started with that Zurich bot study on Reddit. Now let's look at the actual financial and human costs when a company uses deceptive chatbots on its own customers.
It's a classic modern business dilemma, right? Chatbots are incredibly efficient. They slash customer service costs. They're available 24/7. But we know customers would rather talk to a human.
Always,
Yeah.
especially if it's a complicated problem.
And critically, studies show customers penalize an algorithm much more harshly for a mistake than they do a human for the exact same error. There's less forgiveness for a machine.
So when the technology gets really good, like Google Duplex, where you literally can't tell it's a bot, the temptation for a company must be huge.
It creates a clear choice. Do you deceive your customers to get all the economic benefit and avoid that bot backlash? Or are you transparent and risk a negative reaction just because people know they're talking to a machine?
And the research shows that deceptive choice has immediate negative consequences. Let's start with the customers. What was the measurable impact on their trust?
A study looked at prospective customers and found that when an organization used a chatbot deceptively, they were seen as significantly less ethical.
How was the study set up?
There were 3 conditions. In one, the bot pretended to be a human. That's the deceptive one. In the second, the bot said, "Hi, I'm the company bot," totally transparent. And in the third, a control, they gave no information at all.
Right. And the control group is where it gets interesting because that shows the default assumption.
Exactly. The highest level of trust from customers was only in the fully transparent condition. But here's the kicker. Trust levels in the control group, where they didn't know, were almost as low as in the deceptive group.
So if you don't say anything, customers assume you're lying.
They default to suspicion. Transparency isn't just a nice to have, it is an active ingredient required to build trust. Silence is perceived as deception.
The takeaway for any business listening is incredibly clear then. Be upfront about the bot. State its identity right at the beginning of the chat.
It's the cost of doing ethical business. But the damage doesn't stop with the customer. What about the employee who is told their job is to facilitate this lie? That must create a really toxic internal culture.
It creates what we call moral strain, and it does measurable damage inside the company. Employees who have to manage these deceptive bots feel they're being asked to commit an unethical request.
A directive from your boss that violates your own moral code. Exactly. It violates basic social norms of transparency and honesty. And we found this leads to severe, quantifiable consequences for the employer. Employees in that deceptive condition showed significantly lower trust in their boss, and they saw the entire organization as less ethical.
And what was the actual behavioral result of that lost trust? Did they just grumble or did they act on it?
They acted on it. The outcome was stark. They showed much, much greater turnover intentions. In one study, 53% of employees in the deceptive group said they intended to leave the company if they could.
53%. Compared to what in the transparent group?
10%.
Wow, so more than half your workforce is actively looking for the exit because you told them to lie to customers. That is a massive tangible cost to your business.
And it was directly linked to that feeling of being asked to do something unethical. It breaks the psychological contract between the worker and the company. You create an unethical climate, and your best people leave. That costs way more than the chatbot ever saved you.
But the damage doesn't even stop when they walk out the door. It actually follows them to their next job interview. You call this moral spillover.
This was probably the most surprising and sobering finding. The ethical stain of the organization spills over and taints the personal reputation of the employee, even though they're the ones trying to escape the unethical situation.
How did you test that?
We had people evaluate job candidates. Some candidates came from a company known for using deceptive bots, others from a transparent one.
And were these just students playing recruiter or the real deal?
Both. We tested it with simulated managers and then with real professional HR recruiters out in the field. The result was the same. They were significantly less likely to even offer a job to the candidate who came from the deceptive company.
On what grounds? Was it just guilt by association?
They explicitly linked it to a perceived lack of trustworthiness in the candidate themselves. The recruiters inferred that if you were willing to work in that environment, maybe your own ethical standards are a bit shaky. The company's bad reputation had literally bled onto the employee's resume.
So you get penalized for having a toxic company in your work history. That can affect your entire career.
And it had a direct financial impact, too. Recruiters offered the candidates from the deceptive organization a significantly lower starting salary.
How much lower?
In one study with Chinese recruiters, it was over 1,000 RMB a month less. That is a clear monetary penalty that follows a person, all because of a decision their previous company made to lie to customers.
So the single decision to use a deceptive bot ends up eroding public trust, causing a mass exodus of employees, and then financially penalizing those same employees when they try to find a new job. It's a cascade of negative consequences for every single person involved.
So if the national bodies are fragmented, if the academic committees are failing, who is actually in charge of the rules online? And that brings us to our final and maybe most critical point: the incredible power of the private platforms themselves.
We're moving into the realm of private ordering or cyber regulation. The idea that a company's terms of service document is no longer just a contract, it's basically the law of the land on the internet.
It absolutely is. These internet intermediaries, your social media companies, your network operators, they write the rules. And their terms of service can have a binding force that's even stronger than public law.
Stronger? How?
Because they can enforce it instantly and technically. They don't need police or courts. They use algorithms and network architecture to enforce their rules. They can delete your account, shadow ban your content, and you have almost no recourse.
That sounds less like a legal system and more like a private kingdom with an absolute monarch.
That's the comparison many legal scholars make. They call it a form of digital feudalism. These huge private companies have quasi-legislative power. They write the laws. Quasi-executive power, they enforce them with code. And quasi-judicial power, they run their own opaque internal appeals processes.
But the whole foundation of this is supposed to be informed consent, right? That we all read the 2S and freely agree to it.
Which we all know is a legal fiction. These are non-negotiable, take-it-or-leave-it contracts that no normal person reads. And an analysis of 50 major platforms found the language around privacy is written to be intentionally broad and vague.
Why? To give them wiggle room.
To give them the ability to use your data in brand new ways, like, say, training a massive new AI model without ever having to ask for your consent again. They write the contract once to cover anything they might ever want to do.
So it completely strips the user of any real control over their own information?
It does. And they're not even transparent when they change the rules. Only 30% of the platforms we looked at promise to tell you about all changes to their contracts. Most only tell you if the change is significant, a judgment that, of course, they get to make themselves.
That's a huge due process failure.
Yeah.
And if you feel you've been wronged, the 10S often blocks you from seeking justice, too.
It absolutely does. The fine print is full of traps. Our analysis found 26% of platforms make you waive your right to join a class action lawsuit, and 34% impose mandatory arbitration, forcing you into a private, expensive system that usually favors the company. It's designed to keep them out of public court.
So if they write the law, enforce the law, and control the courts, they are the effective regulator. They become the de facto IRB for any research on their platform. And Facebook's history is the perfect, chaotic example of this, isn't it?
Facebook is the ultimate case study. They are the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And their history is just this wild swing between catastrophic failures like Cambridge Analytica.
Right, where 87 million profiles were used for political targeting. That led to a massive $5 billion FTC fine.
A historic fine.
Yeah.
But many critics argued it was just the cost of doing business for a company that size. It didn't fundamentally change their incentives. After that, they tried to do the right thing. They launched this partnership called Social Science One.
The idea was to give safe, anonymized data to academic researchers to study things like elections.
That was the idea. But it was a catastrophe. Just recently, the company had to admit that the data set they provided had serious errors in it. So an unknown number of academic papers based on that data might be completely wrong. Junk science.
So first they failed to protect the data, then they failed to even provide accurate data, and now they've moved on to just blocking research entirely.
That's the latest swing of the pendulum. They recently banned the accounts of researchers from NYU who were studying political ads, claiming they were scraping data. It got so bad the FTC had to send them an open letter criticizing their misleading justifications.
It's the core conflict right there. A platform can go from a data breach that threatens democracy one day to unilaterally blocking legitimate, independent research that might expose their own flaws the next.
And that's exactly why we're seeing a push for legislation now. Things like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, or PAYDA in the U.S. It's an attempt to force social media companies to give vetted, independent researchers access to some of this data. It's a clear signal that Congress has lost all trust in the platforms to regulate themselves.
So let's pull all these threads together. We've really looked at two parallel crises happening at the same time. On one hand, you have the failure of our old national oversight systems, the IRBs, the RECs, to govern a borderless digital world. They're too slow, too fragmented, and they don't have the expertise.
And on the other hand, you have the vacuum they left behind being filled by these incredibly powerful, self-interested private platforms who use their unread terms of service as a kind of private legal code.
And that image of the literal wooden ethics board in Denmark, it's not just a funny story about a bureaucratic problem anymore. It really symbolizes the complete mismatch between our 20th century ethical tools and our 21st century digital reality.
Exactly. When the rules are either non-existent, or they're fragmented, or they're written exclusively by the company you're trying to study, the result is always going to be widespread digital trespass. We saw it with those patient health communities.
And the long-term consequences of this chaos are now so clear. It's not abstract. Deceptive practices, whether they're for a PhD or for corporate profit, they erode public trust, they cause real harm to vulnerable people, they lead to massive employee turnover, and they even damage the careers of individuals because of that moral spillover effect.
Which means the real battle for digital research ethics isn't just about rules. It's a battle over power. Who gets to legislate our digital lives? The nation state or the network? The fight for transparency and access is really a fight to make sure that these private platforms aren't the only ones who get to decide what we know about our own society.
The central challenge for governance now is, how do you build an oversight system that can keep up with the speed and scale of the internet without just handing over all the control to these opaque algorithms and the unilateral, user-hostile rules of a few giant corporations? Can we even build a 21st century ethical framework before the internet makes the very idea of a national framework obsolete?